What is sensory processing disorder, and is it something that your child could be struggling with? Sensory processing has been lumped in together with a bunch of different things. It's not one size fits all, but sensory processing disorder is a condition that pretty much affects how the brain and the nervous system process your environment. So it can affect all five of the senses, but it can just be one or it can be all five. It kind of depends on the severity. For pediatric brain and neurodevelopment, movement and balance tend to be affected most heavily in sensory children, along with like an oversensitivity to their environment. There's two different kinds of sensory processing challenges. There's sensory avoiding behaviors and there's sensory seeking behaviors. Both of these just address that the information from the environment isn't getting to their brain as efficiently as it needs to. It doesn't mean that they only have one, sensory seeking or sensory avoiding. They just can have both. They can have aspects of one, aspects of another, because there are different senses and the way that those are integrated can be different both ways. Sometimes these sensory processing disorders can start very early. They can just start as fussy babies, having colic. They can develop into anxious kids. And then as you start to notice more of their behaviors, you can see that there's more going into it. And really, it's just how they're handling things, throwing tantrums, having meltdowns all of the time is something that can feed into this sensory processing disorder. All kids are going to have meltdowns. All kids are going to throw tantrums. But when it becomes a hindrance on your daily life, that's when we know that there's something bigger going on. What are some of the symptoms that you might notice in sensory processing disorders? It's really dependent on your child. Every child's going to be a little bit different, and sometimes it's hard to tell because kids can't quite communicate what they're feeling inside as well as you can understand it. So some symptoms that sensory seeking kids might have are that they can't sit still. They always seek like a dangerous or a thrill seeking thing, jumping from really high heights, spinning around till they're dizzy, getting to that end of that feeling. They're just trying to get a feeling out of it. Typically they have a high pain threshold because again, they're almost numb. They can't quite get what they're seeking out of it. They rock, they sway, sometimes they can headbang. Sleeping can be an issue. That can be both sides. Visual stimuli they like a lot. So if your kid really likes to sit and watch TV, or if that's like the only thing that they can focus on, typically like to put a lot of things in their mouth, even after the age that would be developmentally normal for that. Signs and symptoms of sensory avoiding kids can be a low pain threshold, so everything feels really intense to them. That's where tags and like a little tiny pebble in their shoe can really bother them and set them off. They can be clumsy, they're feeling a lot. They don't really think about how pain can affect them as far as safety goes. They're just trying to get away from whatever's hurting them. They cover their eyes, their ears. Lights can be really bright. They're really picky with their food because they can feel every surface on there. They don't like to be touched a lot, and they have a really hard time focusing their attention and controlling their emotions. So how can we help these kiddos that are just having a hard time processing their world? As a neurologically focused pediatric chiropractor, I am going to look at a bunch of different things that influence how they're perceiving things. And we like to call this the perfect storm, if you will. It's not just one thing that led them to this. There's a bunch of different things that have all just come together at the right time to make it an issue for their everyday life. When the nervous system gets overwhelmed and stressed, we call it dysautonomia. And it's a term that we mean when the autonomic or the automatic nervous system struggles to properly regulate both the internal and the external environment. It can't quite put the pieces together. So this is one of the very first things to develop in utero. So the brain and the autonomic nervous system can be set or tuned into how the mother is while they're pregnant with them. If there's a really stressful state of the mother, or they're constantly in stress, or something really big happened, it can affect how the baby is programmed with their nervous system. They can be programmed to be constantly in that stress state. And that will develop how their brain and nervous system functions. Another trigger is birth itself. So not just in utero, how they development, but how they were brought into the world with forceps, C-section, vacuum extraction, inductions. All of these can kind of disrupt the normal physiological way that birth is supposed to happen. And it can affect mostly this upper cervical area, which is one of the most important areas for that processing to go through. It's that first gateway between the brain and the rest of the body. So when things can't get through, it's kind of like construction on the highway. There's a detour, and sometimes you might not end up exactly where you want to go. Some of those messages might turn around because the detour is too hard to follow. Some might get through, but it's going to take a lot longer than it needs to, and then it's not going to get through at the time when it needs to happen. It's also the place where your brainstem is. So that is what we like to call the air traffic controller of the body. Its main job is to focus the things getting in and the things getting out. It's for all the 7 senses, including that movement and balance. It's responsible not only for organizing and processing the information, but keeping any unwanted or annoying information out. That unwanted or annoying information you experience as well. We call it nociception, and a lot of people like to think about it as pain, but really it's just noise in the nervous system. Think about if your kid's constantly listening to rock and roll, heavy metal, playing all the time and trying to read a book. Probably not conducive to them being able to read that book. Think about instead if we could influence that system to get rid of the nociception or that noise in order for them to play classical music. Much more easy. Your brain loves the classical music, and it is easier to focus and concentrate during that. That nociception to the brain, that noise, and stressful situations, it's too hard for them to tolerate. It's too much information. Also, if they're constantly moving and seeking out that physical touch and stimulation, they're doing so in order to bring about proprioception, or for them to get some kind of sense of where their body is in the environment. It's a sense of movement. I know it might not seem like this from the outside, but all of that seeking movement or touch and running around and doing that is actually calming for their brain. So they're really trying to help their brain calm that system, and that's what it's having trouble doing. A lot of times we hear that when babies are colicky, fussy, constipated, that they're told, don't worry, you'll just grow out of it. They'll be okay when they're older. And really, most parents have a sense of, but if they're not okay now, how is it just gonna magically disappear? And the truth is it typically doesn't. Typically they just grow into more deeply seated disorders like sensory processing disorder. When a baby is stressed and subluxated at birth, that dysautonomia that we talked about, it sets in right away, which can lead to stressed, overstimulated toddlers, children that struggle with sensory processing disorder and result in frequent tantrums, meltdowns. Neurologically, these challenges are one and the same. They just get a new name and a new diagnosis. So they're not fussy, colicky babies because now they can do other things. They're more physically adapt. And so they'll change how they're processing through the world, but the root cause is still the same. I typically see that sensory processing disorder kids have been to a lot of other people. So they've seen OTs, they've seen PTs, they've been to speech therapy. They're doing all of these things, but it's kind of not quite clicking, or it's taking a lot longer than they want it to. And those therapies absolutely help their system. But again, if that information, if that air traffic controller is having a hard time getting messages in and out, then it's still going to be hard for them to get those good messages in. So if we can clear that air traffic control, if we can get the stress out of the system, then they can take all that information and training and really start running with it. So how do I help care for these kids in my office? First, we need to dig back into the root causes of where the stress and the subluxation began, where that tension in the nervous system started. We do a deep dive in the case history, and then we use an insight scanning technology. In 10 to 15 minutes, through 3 different scans, they're non-invasive. They measure and locate subluxation in the autonomic nervous system. So this helps me put together a customized care plan that fits for your child's needs, and it helps restore function and balance to their nervous system, helping that air traffic controller get those messages in clean and clear. Once they start their care plan with gentle adjustments, this helps release the stress and tension on the nervous system, and then their therapies become more effective. It's going to take a little while for their brain to start reorganizing. We don't learn a new task right away. It has to work through it. It's like a workout program for their brain. It's not just one time and then their brain can do it all. It has to keep working at it and build these new pathways, just like building a new road. Parents, we know you've been on the long road for this, and it's been degrading for you. It's been hard and heartbreaking, but we've seen a lot of these kids, and we can make that journey a lot easier for you and for your child to set them up for success in the future.